I think looking back is really important. And this talk came out of my curiosity about two Danish hospitals, which I'll come to shortly. So looking back to go forward, and it's surprising how when we look back, we find there are some very good ideas. So typology, where next? The issue here really is it the inside that's determining what the hospital typology is, or is it the outside? And I would argue in a way that it's the outside, it's the urban environment, it's the site, the topography, topology, and so on. So I think as I go through, a few issues will come up. I'll try and address them the best I can. And the two hospitals that I did look at, I've had some involvement in as a consultant advisor to the state capital region. One was at the top of the top Vidor hospital was to comment on their internal proposals to extend the hospital, which was actually a circle on the end, on the left-hand end. And after much soul searching, I said, I think you need to go to an architectural competition. But what I didn't realize was that the winning firm would just simply put their signature building on the end of the existing hospital. And you'll probably recognize that later when you see the name. On the other hospital, New North Zealand, we were asked to calculate the size of the site that they would need, or the land they would need to buy to replace the existing Hillerød hospital. And we came up with, I think, 33 hectares, and they purchased 31.5 or something like that. So we were in the same ballpark, and that was the extent of our involvement in that project. Now, I've actually put the last two slides first because I have a habit of overrunning, and I thought I'd better get my points across at the beginning. And really what I'm doing here is I'm discussing the if you like, the two extremes, the horizontal typology and the vertical typology. And I don't need to go through the list, but what I would say about the horizontal, and by the way, I could only really find one reasonably contemporary hospital in Australia that actually you might call a more horizontal hospital than a vertical hospital. And we'll come back to that later. The word that really grabs me there, though, is this idea of it being democratic. It's flexible, technically flexible, spatially flexible. You've got lateral relationships between functions, increased interfaces with stakeholders. It's able to accommodate diversity and multiculturalism, and it's easily expanded or contracted. And you can colonize a low hospital. Now, if you go to the vertical, and again, we've got a few standard values or principles which you'll all recognize, but then we get to the word undemocratic. It's non-negotiable, technically. When you build tall, there's no discussion about where lifts and stairs goes. That's fixed. The size of the floor plate and the shape is fixed within reason. It's got limited configurations because of those constraints. The stacked functional zones are fixed in size. You can't ebb and flow between what we call departments, but actually are functional units. There's reduced engagement with stakeholders because it's non-negotiable, it's inflexible. There's a disconnection with ground and therefore country. And so we're all talking about connection with country. Where is the connection with country in a vertical building? Limited access and wayfinding opportunities. It's unsociable. Where does the business get done? Well, it usually gets done in lobbies and foyers where people move horizontally, not in lift cores and lobbies. It's first cost, not whole life. It's got a reduced lifespan, and it's poor value for the community. So, and then you get this wonderful phrase which kind of sums it up. This is about values, and it's about thinking about the hospital from a developer's point of view and not from a community infrastructure point of view. And I think that's one of our problems. And then you get contemporary discussions. The one on the left, you may know about. It's not built yet. And again, the one on the right, you may know about too. And I just find it extraordinary that we have these two extremes in discussion. And obviously there's reasons why they are like that. But I think the issue here is scale. So how big should the hospital be? And in terms of typology, what should it be? So I won't go back over the sort of starting point that Chris took, but just to say that the two examples, or two photos or photo montages on the right show both a very old hospital being expanded and a brand new hospital being conceived, the Pavilion Hospital. But back in the day, we were developing technologies that allow us to go tall. Once we got lifts and people could see the office buildings could be created, again, if you like, a sort of representation of a very capitalist approach to development, then the hospital was inevitably going to follow, as did housing. But we know from housing what ghastly environments they make for people who have no choice. And the public hospital is a place that people have no choice. The private hospital, on the other hand, is usually a department or a specialty, and people have choice. And it's not an issue when you go to a private hospital. So there's some Guy's is probably the exception. It was one of the tallest hospitals in the world. Now I'm going to go back to a sort of the architectural profession and what they were doing post-war, because we've moved on a few decades here. And there was a fascination about city planning, about particularly post-war, the sort of golden age of welfare infrastructure, and lots of ideas. And most of them seemed to be at the time when it wasn't about office building and developer-approached architecture. It was horizontal. And you can see the granularity, you can see the flexibility, you can see the ability to extend or contract or colonize in all of these images. And then public housing was also thinking about how do we recreate neighborhoods and parts of the city, but deal with the car? How do we manage to design streets which can cope with the social requirements and maybe the car separation? So there were some very sophisticated developments in housing, and these same architects were then often moving into hospital design, healthcare design, and then as we get today, we finally got to Denmark, and so, you know, here you can see similar ideas about housing, horizontal, integrated with nature. I put the one in Drigor in the bottom there because that town or city, I found someone's PhD that looked at this town. It was designed for daylight and for social interaction, but the whole village or town that they put together is really about daylight, and that was going to be another theme, but we'll come to that. And as Chris said, we had the idea of the templated hospital. I think what I would say about this is really about circulation. It's about how to organize the streets, the connections, and they are working with the functionality. But you don't have to have incredibly complicated plans, deep plans. There's a commonality in most of this, which is to get daylight in at a reasonable span. And again, I won't dwell on it. It's just part of the story. And then you had a more sort of climate appropriate. No, sorry, this is not that one. This is McMaster, which is an interesting hospital. It's probably one of my favourites, but there's a brutality about it which I think turns a lot of people off. But when you go inside, it's quite intimate. It's got wonderful carpets and colour systems and lighting, and there's daylight in abundance. What's interesting about it, especially when you're walking around the hospital, maybe not in all the departments, it's been, I think in the first 25 years, it had 50 projects inside it that changed it. And I found a thesis about that, which I've put in some of the plans where you can see these changes being logged. And so that, if you like, represents a high point in hospital design in some ways, about flexibility, about the philosophy of designing effectively a shelling core building and then putting it out, picking up on Chris's theme. But here's an interesting one, which is a tower and a podium, but not a tower on a podium. So you have the logistics building, which is the grid, and very, very simply organized, and then the tower, which is a different form of construction, sitting alongside. The interesting thing about this hospital was that when I visited roughly in 2000, only 50% of the tower was occupied. They hadn't got above about the 10th story. And it had been like that for years. I just put it in because it's sort of, the interesting bit of this is the discussion really about the low logistics building, which needed all those very important connections, and the grid system, which allows for flexibility and good access. And then we get to Vidor, which is a very unpromising looking hospital, but it was a hospital where from the research that Bridget Hansen did, which I found, it was the first hospital that did proper health planning, stakeholder engagement, discussions of route systems and pathways. This was designed it won a competition in 1963, and it was finally opened in about 1973. So it went through quite a lot of development, and it's got a green roof. It's got 5 hectares of roof garden and quite a lot of courtyards, as you can see. And these are the competition drawings. On the right, you can see the prefabrication. It was all modular, off-site and on-site. 9.6 by 8.4 grid, incredibly flexible. And I was very lucky to stumble across this, just looking through some of these books on hospital design. And I thought, and I got to go and visit it. That was the interesting thing. And I found it fascinating to go there. And then a bit more, I won't dwell on that. Very simple wayfinding system. Major streets, minor streets, then the vertical system which intersects with the car parking underneath. So it's got underground car parking, and I'll come back to that shortly, because that's, and a low entrance, which is quite interesting too. And then here's the extension. The Schmidt Hammer Larsen did that, and then that was the original. And on the edge of the hospital, you can't actually see any windows. It's a completely sealed box, the garden on top, and then the pavilions. So it's a pavilion on a podium, this project. And inside, they recently reworked some of the internal circulation in order to get more daylight in. So although they had the courtyards, they felt that wasn't enough, so they've reorganized it internally. You can see from the top right, they had a mobile cart system from the 1960s, which picked the carts up and took them on tracks, and then took them straight up in vertical ducts and arrived at the inpatient wards where they discharged the food. They got you can order a meal and get it in 10 minutes, and it's a la carte. And then we get to North Zealand, and this one was fundamentally designed on the principles for all. The brief said elasticity, generality, and flexibility. And then it gives you a reason why they chose it. And I guess you could have chosen any one of those. But they chose this, and this is a unique shape. It's part of a new town, or a revitalized town north of Copenhagen, and is close to a railway station, and then it's going to be developed all around. It's only really 4 levels, and the diagram in the top right-hand corner sort of shows the architectural idea. We do in the office, and it's the only time I'm going to talk about the office, we do a lot of analysis of hospitals and their sites to decipher how the land is being used and what the FSR is and so on. Interestingly, neither of them get anywhere near 1. And in fact, very few hospitals in Australia are above 1, even in the cities. There's a few. I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but there are some interesting numbers there, which the buffer zone in all hospitals tends to be getting on for 50%. And then you've got the buildings and the cars and so on. The cars and the roads normally are getting up to 25%. And in both of these, they don't get anywhere near that. So some lessons to be learned. I won't go into the detail. And then we analysed the hospitals and compared them. And that was the interesting bit, and you'll see in a minute. Essentially, they have the same DNA, but they look completely different. And what fascinated me was when, and you can see from the diagrams below and the sort of basic typology there, when you get into it, that's what's going on. And that's what took me on the journey to really get into the analysis, because I thought there's something going on here. One was designed 50 years after the other. And obviously looking at things like gardens and the spatial and the distribution of lifts and so on, which I'll come back to. Just to say that New North Zealand has 42 lifts for 120,000 square meters. It's 1 every 3,000. The old hospital has got 1 for every 7,000. And I would imagine it here and in the UK, it's probably heading towards 1 every 7 or 8, 10,000. We looked at the distribution of the lifts and the main public space and the connectors and how you get around the hospital. And you see in that the central, the plan on the right, how quite clever it is in getting you back to where you need to be if you get lost. You can't really get lost in this hospital, from what I can see. But I haven't been around it. It's only just being built at the moment. And then we compared the lifts, we compared the layout. And the reason I'm doing this is that I'm floating 2 ideas. One is that we seem to be trying to cut corners when we design hospitals. We take cores out, we reduce the number of lifts, we reduce the number of stairs. But these are the things that make the hospital work. When I asked the head of the New North Zealand Hospital team, who was talking at Sydney last year or the year before, she said that they wanted the lifts to give functionality and efficiency. So we weren't going to cut lifts. And look at the number they've got. They've got 8 passenger lifts, but they've got 32 bed technical and logistics lifts. I don't think we do that, and we've got lost. And here's again the garden, just really comparing the nature. And then the courtyards themselves. Now on the left we have 2-story podium, and on the right a single-story podium. And for that reason, they're slightly different in size and proportion. And you'll see why there on the left, because they're both roughly 40 degrees in the cutoff. I just thought that was quite interesting, sort of nerdy kind of interesting. And then on the right, we're looking at daylight. So everywhere that's colored blue is where daylight gets penetration into the plan. But I haven't got you the percentages. Sorry about that. On the left, near North Zealand, every operating theatre has a window onto a courtyard. They didn't think about that perhaps back in the 60s, but interesting, you wouldn't have expected that. And then the car parking is a bit controversial because the older hospital is so much better. Time? Okay, nearly done. And then just to finish, so these are climate appropriate ideas for the typologies. We've got piano, Renzo piano saying no higher than the trees. Brunet-Saunier essentially pushing a grid system which gives them ultimate flexibility to design just about anything you possibly could. That's your showing core, and I think that possibly came out of Chelsea Westminster. And look at the flexibility in there to be able to rearrange all your different functions in a basic form. And then finally, French hospitals, contemporary Chinese hospitals, there's a big difference. UK, Australia, Canada, North America, again. And then lastly, perhaps disaggregation and city integration is the way to go. And that's probably where we've got the opportunity to have a more flexible way of adding and contracting the hospital. And then finally, this one is quite interesting because it mixes vertical and horizontal systems and tries to integrate the two. And that's a hospital that's being done in Paris. And then we're back. And thank you.